Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. You know we love getting into the nitty-gritty of royal history and how monarchs made their mark on the world. So today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going back to ancient Greece, but not to talk about kings and queens. Instead, we're going to look at Athens and how their lack of a king, their radical democracy, actually shaped their fate in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta.
Yeah, it's a really unique perspective. Most people think of ancient Greece and they picture all these powerful rulers. But Athens was different. It was a true pioneer in democracy. But that same system that made them so unique ended up being both their strength and their weakness during this massive conflict with Sparta.
That's wild when you dig into the sources.
Yeah.
Like after the Sicilian Expedition, Athens was devastated. I mean, they launched this huge campaign to try and take over Sicily, this super important island. But it backfired spectacularly. They lost almost their entire army and navy. You'd think that would be the end of them, right?
You'd think so, right? Most states would be completely crippled by a loss like that. But the Spartans, with their kings and their council of elders, they didn't jump at the chance to crush Athens. They were much more cautious, more deliberate. The Spartans really focused on long-term strategies instead of just chasing quick victories.
So instead of going for the kill, they just kind of wore Athens down.
Exactly. It was a war of attrition, and they played it brilliantly. First, they allied themselves with Persia. Can you believe that? And they used Persian gold to build up their own navy, a navy powerful enough to finally challenge Athens at sea. On top of that, they were stirring up rebellions all throughout the Athenian Empire. It was a slow bleed.
Wow, so Sparta's playing 4D chess, and Athens is over here trying to recover from this massive blow.
Yeah, and it's right here where you see the difference between these two systems. Sparta, with its kings and council, is thinking long-term, and Athens, with its democracy, is dealing with all these internal struggles.
Well, it's an innovative system, sure,
Yeah.
but the sources also paint a picture of Athenian democracy as, well, vault.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Decisions in Athens were made by the assembly, which was thousands of citizens. You can imagine how chaotic those meetings must have been. Whoever was the most persuasive, whoever could really play on people's emotions, they had the power to sway the entire assembly. Sometimes this led to brilliant strategies, thinking outside the box. But other times it led to some really bad decisions, like impulsive moves driven by passion and not logic.
It's like that saying, too many cooks in the kitchen.
Mm.
Speaking of bad decisions, I was looking back at the timeline. Why on earth did Athens decide to attack Sparta after that disaster in Sicily? I mean, they were still reeling from that loss.
Yeah, that's a question that has baffled historians for centuries. It's almost like they just couldn't help themselves. Some argue it was a desperate attempt to regain some of their lost prestige. Others think they were trying to deter further Spartan aggression, like, hey, we're still here, don't mess with us. But honestly, it could just be good old Athenian hubris. Yeah, that overconfidence, that sense of invincibility.
Yeah.
They believed in their democracy. They believed in their navy. They thought they were untouchable.
That's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It often is.
And it sounds like this aggressive move just played right into Sparta's hands.
It did. It allowed them to keep up their strategy of slowly choking off the Athenian Empire. It's like Athens was fighting two wars at once, one against Sparta and one against themselves.
I guess that internal struggle isn't too surprising given how passionate those assembly debates must have been.
Oh, it was constant. In fact, in 411 BC, a group of Athenian elites, they were fed up with how democracy was going to. They actually staged a coup, and for a short time, they replaced democracy with an oligarchy rule by a small group.
Wait a minute, an oligarchy in the birthplace of democracy.
It just goes to show you, even the most revolutionary systems, they're not immune to instability. And I think this also highlights those inherent tensions within Athenian democracy. They loved the idea of citizen participation, but it also made them vulnerable to factionalism, to demagogues, even mob rule.
It's almost like they were too free. Too much freedom can lead to chaos, especially when you're in the middle of a war.
That's a good point. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the trials of the Athenian generals after the Battle of Arginusae in 406.
Oh yeah, I read about that. Major Athenian naval victory, but it ended in tragedy and controversy.
Huge victory, yes. But the 8 generals who led the fleet were accused of neglecting their duty. They were accused of failing to rescue sailors who had been thrown overboard during the battle.
But the sources say a storm made rescue impossible. It sounds like they were scapegoated for something beyond their control.
That's the consensus among most historians. But the assembly, fueled by public outrage and the grief of those who had lost loved ones, they condemned 6 of the generals to death.
Wow, so even after a major victory, they turned on their own leaders.
It was a purely political move, a stark example of how Athenian democracy under pressure could turn against its own heroes.
It's a chilling reminder of the power of mob mentality.
It makes you question, doesn't it? Even in a system designed for fairness and justice, are there inherent flaws that can't be overcome?
It's a sobering thought. And the trial of the generals, it almost feels like a preview to another, even more famous trial, that of Socrates.
There are definitely some parallels there. Both cases highlight the tension within Athenian democracy, the potential for the system to be swayed by emotion, by political maneuvering. And in both cases, justice and reason took a backseat.
And Socrates, I mean, he was already a controversial figure in Athens, even before the war started.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
He was famous, or maybe infamous, for his constant questioning. He challenged everyone, even the most powerful citizens, forcing them to confront their own beliefs and assumptions.
He was using the Socratic method. Look at how-
Exactly. Engaging in dialogue, asking probing questions. He wanted to expose inconsistencies in people's thinking. It wasn't always a pleasant experience, especially if you were on the receiving end of his questioning.
He was like the Athenian gadfly.
The perfect description.
But in a way, he was also embodying the ideals of democracy, encouraging critical thinking and open debate. But I guess after the war, those very ideals became suspect.
Yeah, you have to remember the context. The Peloponnesian War, it left deep scars on Athenian society. It wasn't just the physical destruction, the loss of life. It was the psychological trauma, the erosion of trust in institutions, in their leaders.
People were craving stability.
Desperate for it.
But it sounds like that desire for order came at a steep price. The suppression of free speech and intellectual freedom.
And that's where Socrates found himself in dangerous territory. Remember, he was constantly criticizing Athenian democracy, questioning its effectiveness, pointing out its flaws. And in the aftermath of a devastating war, those criticisms didn't sit well with many people.
So they turned on him.
They accused him of impiety, of corrupting the youth with his ideas, of undermining Athenian society.
It's ironic, isn't it? The people who championed democracy during the war are now turning against someone who embodies its core principles.
It's a complicated situation. Athens was trying to heal, to rebuild. And Socrates, with his constant questioning, he became a scapegoat, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong.
His trial, it almost feels like a mirror image of the general's trial.
I agree. Driven by fear, by political opportunism, not a genuine desire for justice.
The charges against him were vague, almost impossible to prove.
But his defense, as we know from Plato's account, it was brilliant. He argued passionately for intellectual freedom, for the pursuit of truth, no matter the cost.
But it wasn't enough.
The jury, reflecting the anxieties of the time, found him guilty and sentenced him to death.
It's heartbreaking, really. The birthplace of democracy, a society that prided itself on philosophy and debate, condemns one of its greatest minds to death.
The death of Socrates is a pivotal moment. It marks the end of an era of unprecedented philosophical inquiry in Athens, and the beginning of a period of caution, conformity, a fear of challenging the status quo.
But his legacy lives on, right?
Oh, absolutely. His ideas, his method of questioning, they've continued to influence thinkers for centuries. He's a constant reminder that intellectual freedom is fragile, that dissent must be protected, even in times of crisis.
We've been focusing a lot on Athens, but I want to shift gears a bit and talk about Spartan leadership. Our listeners are fascinated by royal figures and their influence on history.
Makes sense.
So what can you tell us about the Spartan kings? How did they shape the war's outcome?
Well, Sparta was a different beast altogether. They had this dual kingship, meaning they had two kings ruling jointly, plus a council of elders and an assembly of citizens. But the kings, especially during wartime, they held a lot of power.
So even though they had elements of democracy, Sparta's military and foreign policy were still heavily influenced by their monarchs.
Without a doubt. And one figure who really stands out is King Lysander. He emerged as a brilliant strategist and a cunning politician in the later stages of the war.
He's the one who ultimately led Sparta to victory, right?
He is. His decisive victory at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405, that was the final nail in the coffin for Athens.
But then, instead of wiping Athens off the map, he decided to spare them.
It was a surprising move. He chose to install a pro-Spartan oligarchy, those infamous 30 Tyrants. They ruled Athens with an iron fist.
Why would he do that? Why not just crush them completely?
Lysander, he was a pragmatist. He knew that completely destroying Athens would create a power vacuum. It would be an open invitation for Persia or other rivals to move in. Plus, he recognized the strategic and economic value of having Athens, even a weakened Athens, under their thumb.
It was a calculated move. Secure their power in the Aegean, avoid the headaches of direct occupation.
Exact.
But didn't it backfire?
Oh, it did. The 30 Tyrants were so brutal, so oppressive, that they ignited a massive uprising. The Athenian people, they overthrew the oligarchy and reinstated their democracy.
Wow, so even in victory, Sparta couldn't escape the unintended consequences.
It's a classic example of how even the best-laid plans can be completely upended by human nature.
I guess there's always something we can't predict.
There is. And the story of the Peloponnesian War, it doesn't end with Sparta's victory. Its legacy, the lessons we can learn from it, they still resonate today, especially as we grapple with questions of power, conflict, the challenges of maintaining a stable world order.
It's a complex topic.
It is.
I'm particularly intrigued by that idea of the Thucydides Trap. Was the conflict between Athens and Sparta truly inevitable?
It's a fascinating question, and one that we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
So let's dive into this Thucydides Trap.
Oh.
What exactly is that, and how does it relate to the Athenian-Spartan showdown?
Well, the term comes from Thucydides himself, the Athenian historian who lived through the war and wrote that incredible account of it. He argued that the war wasn't just some random event, some minor squabble blown out of proportion. He believed it was inevitable. It was a fundamental clash between a rising power, Athens, and an established power, Sparta.
So it wasn't really about specific disagreements or territorial disputes. It was more about this underlying tension, this power struggle.
Exactly. The Thucydides trap suggests that when you have a rising power that starts to challenge the dominance of an existing one, conflict becomes almost impossible to avoid. The established power feels threatened, they start getting paranoid, the rising power feels like they're being held back, they get frustrated. And that creates this spiral of suspicion and hostility.
That definitely seems to fit what happened between Athens and Sparta. Athens, with their navy and their empire, they were definitely stepping on Sparta's toes.
Right, and Sparta, they weren't going to just sit back and watch their power fade away. They felt threatened, so they tried to contain Athenian ambition. And boom, you have the Peloponnesian War.
It's kind of depressing, though, isn't it? Like, are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? Is conflict between rising and established powers just inevitable?
Well, Thucydides himself wasn't a complete pessimist. He believed that if we understand the forces at play, if we recognize the patterns, then maybe, just maybe, we can make better decisions and avoid disaster. And there are actually scholars today who are actively researching ways to, hack the Thucydides trap. They're looking for ways to find peaceful coexistence, even when you have these massive shifts in power.
It gives me a little bit of hope, at least. Now, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to circle back to. You brought up this science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem. What does a sci-fi book have to do with ancient Greece or even modern geopolitics?
It might seem like a strange connection, but bear with me. The three-body problem, it deals with some of the same core issues we see in the Peloponnesian War, just on a much, much grander scale. Imagine humanity facing an existential threat from an alien civilization. That's the premise of the book. And one of the main themes is how suspicion and miscommunication can escalate tension, even when both sides have a common interest in survival.
It's like even when we're talking about aliens, we still see those same patterns of fear and mistrust and miscalculation that fueled the conflict between Athens and Sparta.
Precisely. Sicilian, the author, he introduces this idea of a chain of suspicion. Basically, each side is constantly second-guessing the other's motives. They assume the worst, and that leads to a whole series of preemptive actions like, oh, they're building up their weapons, so we better build up ours even more. It's a trap that's incredibly hard to break free from, especially when you factor in different cultures, ideologies, historical baggage.
It feels incredibly relevant today, with all the polarization and tension we see between countries. So is there any way to break this chain of suspicion? Can we actually avoid falling into the Thucydides trap?
Well, it's a tough question. Some experts believe that more transparency and open communication can help build trust and reduce the chances of misinterpreting each other's actions. Others emphasize the importance of finding common ground, areas where we can cooperate, even if we're competing in other areas.
Sounds like there's no easy fix.
I wish there was. It requires a lot of effort from all sides. You need skillful diplomacy, a willingness to see things from the other perspective, and most importantly, a recognition that our own actions can contribute to the problem.
That's a powerful insight.
It is.
And it brings us back to the Peloponnesian War and this whole idea of how individual choices, both by leaders and ordinary people, can have a ripple effect throughout history.
The Athenian generals choosing to attack after Sicily, the assembly condemning Socrates to death, Lysander installing the 30 Tyrants. These were all choices made by individuals, and those choices had huge consequences.
And what about the choices we make today? Do you think we can learn from the mistakes of the past? Can we break free from these cycles of conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But studying history, understanding the forces that drive conflict, it's a good place to start. If we can learn to recognize the patterns, maybe we can find a way to change the game.
It's kind of overwhelming when you think about it, all these complex forces shaping history. But, amidst all the tragedy and conflict of the Peloponnesian War, there's also this incredible story of resilience. Like Athens losing their entire navy and then bouncing back to win major battles. It's remarkable.
It really is. And even after the war, after the defeat, they managed to rebuild their city and their democracy. It speaks to the human spirit. That ability to endure, to adapt, to overcome even the most devastating setbacks.
It gives me hope. If Athens could survive all that, then maybe, just maybe, we can learn from their experience and find a way to navigate the challenges of our own time.
I think that's the key takeaway here. History, it's not just about dates and names and battles. It's about understanding human nature, the patterns of behavior that have shaped our world for centuries.
And maybe, by studying those patterns, by recognizing the traps we've fallen into time and again, we can make better choices.
Exactly. Maybe we can break free from the cycle of conflict. Maybe we can build a future where cooperation and understanding prevail.
I like the sound of that. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Peloponnesian War. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. And remember, history is full of lessons if we're willing to listen.